Welcome to Stories Junction. Let's begin today's story. Everyone says your wedding day is supposed to be the happiest day of your life. That's what I'd always heard, too. But if you'd asked me on that day, I would have told you it was anything but that. It wasn't just bad, it was a disaster. A calamity of epic proportions. Let me take you back a bit. 3 years ago, I met Eleanor. She was beautiful, sharp, and had a laugh that could light up a room. It was impossible not to smile when she laughed. It was infectious. From the moment I saw her, I knew I was hooked. We went through the ups and downs, like any couple does. We fought, we made up, and we grew. Eventually, I decided to propose. I thought we had weathered every storm. Everything felt perfect. Then, 1 week before the wedding, it all started to unravel. I was sitting in my friend Evan's apartment, unwinding after a long day of work. Evan is the type of guy who doesn't filter his thoughts. Honesty comes easy for him, sometimes a little too easy, but he's loyal, and I trust him completely. We were having a couple of beers, the buzz of the day fading away, when he hesitated. I looked up at him, sensing something was off. "James, there's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice taking on a serious tone. That sentence, the one that always comes right before bad news, made my stomach drop. "What's up?" I asked, setting my beer down. Evan rubbed the back of his neck, looking anywhere but at me. "You sure about Eleanor, man?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Of course I'm sure." He hesitated again, clearly trying to find the right words. "I saw her last Friday at the downtown bar," he said, and I could tell this wasn't going to be good. "She wasn't alone." I laughed, trying to brush it off. "What? She was probably just hanging out with her friends, man. You know how she is." Evan didn't laugh. He leaned in closer, his voice lower now. "I thought so too. But then I saw her kiss another guy. Not just a friendly peck, James. A full-on kiss. Like the kind that makes you want to throw up." My world froze. I didn't believe him at first. I thought Evan must have been mistaken, or maybe it was some other woman. But something inside me, a feeling I couldn't shake, told me otherwise. The unease settled in my stomach like a stone. I went home that night, trying to dismiss Evan's words. I told myself it was nothing. But as I lay in bed, my thoughts kept drifting back to his words. Asterisk a full-on kiss. Asterisk it didn't make sense. Eleanor and I had been happy. At least I thought we had been. But now doubts crept in. Was this just the beginning? Was she hiding something from me? The next morning, I decided to pay closer attention. Small things started to stand out. Subtle changes I hadn't noticed before. Eleanor always kept her phone turned away from me, as if she was hiding something. Then there were the late-night texts she claimed were from work, the ones that never seemed to have a clear explanation. And when I asked about her plans for the day, her tone would shift slightly, like she was on edge. Then one afternoon, while she was in the shower, I grabbed her phone. My heart raced as I scrolled through her messages, but there was nothing. No messages from unknown numbers. No cryptic texts. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling something wasn't right. So, I did what any paranoid person might do. I followed her. For a few days, there was nothing to be concerned about. She didn't go anywhere unusual, didn't stay out late. But then, 2 days before the wedding, she started getting ready in a way I hadn't seen before. Eleanor wore a fitted dress, high heels, and her makeup was flawless. She twirled in front of the mirror, clearly pleased with how she looked. "Tomorrow's the big day," she said with a grin. "I'm heading out with Sarah and the girls tonight. We're doing some last-minute shopping for the wedding. I'll grab a bite afterward and head to Sarah's house to spend the night." I nodded, trying to seem normal, though my mind was already elsewhere, already on the path of suspicion. The second she left the apartment, I grabbed my jacket. I had to know the truth. I followed her, keeping a safe distance as she drove through the city. She wasn't heading towards Sarah's place. She was weaving through streets until she pulled over in a quiet neighborhood. My pulse quickened as I watched her stop the car, get out, and stand by the curb, clearly waiting for someone. Then he appeared. The man was tall, wearing a dark jacket. He walked toward her confidently, and when he reached her, they kissed. Not just a brief peck, a kiss that felt like the world was ending. My stomach twisted into knots. I didn't know what to do. I had to see more, had to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining this. I grabbed my phone and snapped a few photos from the car, the flash dim in the darkness, but the images clear enough. Eleanor's lips pressed against his, her eyes closed in passion. My hands shook as I captured every second. This was real. She wasn't just out with some friends. She was with him. I watched as they exchanged a few words, then got into his car and drove off. I started my car again, following them for miles, my mind a storm of disbelief. They eventually pulled into a hotel parking lot. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was far from a dive. It wasn't where I'd ever expect Eleanor to be, especially not with someone else. I stayed hidden behind a row of cars, watching them walk into the hotel together, Eleanor's hand tucked into his. It was clear they weren't just friends. The thought hit me hard, my stomach churning. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to confront her, demand answers. But I stayed still, watching them, as the weight of the situation sank in. Eleanor, the woman I was about to marry, was not the person I thought she was. The moment they entered the hotel, my chest tightened with a sense of helplessness I couldn't shake. I stood in the parking lot for what felt like hours, frozen in place, watching the silhouette of Eleanor and the man disappear into the building. My mind was spinning in circles. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of twisted nightmare. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I needed answers. I couldn't just walk away and pretend everything was fine. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. I had to know, for sure, had to understand what was happening between them. My stomach churned as I made a split-second decision. I parked my car a little further down the street and walked into the hotel. I tried to stay calm, but it was impossible. My hands were shaking, and every step felt like it was taking me closer to a truth I wasn't ready to face. I approached the front desk, keeping my voice steady as I greeted the receptionist. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound composed. "Can you tell me which room Eleanor Collins is in?" She just checked in with a man. The receptionist's eyes flicked nervously toward the lobby, then back to his computer. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't give out that information." I clenched my fists, my mind struggling to keep it together. "Listen, I'm about to marry that woman, and I just saw her walk in here with someone else. I need to know which room they're in." The receptionist hesitated, his gaze darting around the lobby as though he was worried someone might overhear. I could feel my patience thinning. "Please," I said, lowering my voice, "just tell me the room number. I'm not here to cause a scene. I just need to know." He sighed, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Room 312, he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "But please, don't make a scene, sir." I didn't wait for him to change his mind. Without another word, I turned and headed for the elevators. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind was a blur of confusion and anger. I knew where I was headed, but I didn't know what I would find. What could I possibly do when the truth hit me? The elevator doors slid open, and I stepped out onto the third floor, my legs trembling. I walked down the hallway, every step bringing me closer to their door. I stood outside, my ear pressed against the thin wall, trying to listen for any sign of what was happening inside. The muffled sounds of laughter and voices drifted through the door. Eleanor's voice, low and melodic, mixed with the man's laughter. My stomach turned in knots. I stayed still, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It felt like an eternity before I made a decision. I couldn't just stand there anymore. I couldn't just listen and pretend I wasn't dying to know what was happening behind that door. My heart ached, but there was no turning back. I needed to find out the truth. I walked back to the front desk, booking a room on the same floor. Room 311. It wasn't far from theirs, and it would give me a vantage point. The plan wasn't perfect, but I had to do something. Anything. When I returned to the hallway, I slipped into the room as quietly as I could, my heart racing. The door clicked shut behind me, and I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear anything from the room next door. The muffled laughter was still there, but it was distant now, as though it was growing more intimate. I stepped out onto the balcony, hoping to catch a glimpse of them. The cold air hit my face, but it did little to calm the storm inside me. I looked across the gap between our balconies, and for a moment, I felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, I heard it, the sound of the sliding door from their room opening. My heart skipped a beat. I rushed back inside, hoping they hadn't seen me. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to remain hidden. Through the thin wall separating our rooms, I could hear them again, their voices low and soft. They were so close, so unaware of me, that it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Minutes passed. Time seemed to stretch on forever before they finally went back inside. The weight of the silence in the room felt suffocating, and I was left standing there, unsure of what to do next. But I couldn't stay there forever. I had to know. I had to see. I couldn't turn back now. I glanced down at the gap separating the balconies. My heart pounded as I made the decision. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. I could do this. I had to. I jumped lightly, landing on their balcony with barely a sound. I moved toward the sliding door, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. It was like I wasn't in control of my own body. My fingers brushed against the cold metal, and I slid it open just enough to see inside. What I saw made my stomach twist, my whole world spinning. Eleanor, the woman I was about to marry, was tangled in the sheets with another man. They were kissing, their lips pressed together with a desperate intensity. I could see their clothes starting to come off, each moment more intimate than the last. The knot in my chest tightened until I could barely breathe. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to be here, didn't want to see this, but I couldn't stop myself. This was the truth, and I had to face it. I pulled my phone out, my hands trembling as I started recording. Every second felt like an eternity, but I stood there, motionless, watching as they continued, unaware of my presence. The sound of their laughter and whispers filled the room, and I felt like I was suffocating in the chaos. Every image, every sound was burned into my mind. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't erase what I had seen. It was too much to process, but I knew one thing for certain. This was the moment everything changed. Finally, I stepped back, my heart racing as I quietly jumped back onto my own balcony. My body was shaking, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it all. Eleanor had betrayed me. She was no longer the woman I thought I knew. The woman I had been planning to marry, the one I had trusted with everything, was nothing like I had imagined. The drive home felt like a haze, as if the world outside had become a blur, the city lights flickering through the windshield like disjointed memories. I could barely focus on the road, my hands clenched tightly on the steering wheel as the gravity of what I had just witnessed settled deep within me. My heart felt as though it had been ripped from my chest, shredded and left behind, a cold and empty shell. Eleanor, the woman I was supposed to marry, had just shattered everything we had built. I couldn't even bring myself to look at the photos I had taken. I knew they were there, hidden in my phone like a silent reminder of the betrayal. I didn't need to see them again. I knew what had happened. I had watched it unfold in front of me. Too real, too painful to deny. But I couldn't let this go. I couldn't pretend that nothing had changed. The wedding was 2 days away, and I had no idea how I was supposed to face her, face everyone, after everything had unraveled. I couldn't imagine standing there, in front of our families and friends, pretending like nothing was wrong, like I hadn't just discovered the darkest truth about the woman I was about to pledge my life to. The thought made my blood run cold. The house felt different when I walked through the door. It was eerily quiet, as if it too knew that everything had shifted, that there was no turning back. I tossed my jacket onto the couch, my body moving almost automatically, my mind a tangled mess of anger, confusion, and disbelief. I couldn't stand the thought of her walking down the aisle in 2 days. I couldn't stand the thought of her lying to everyone, pretending everything was fine while I knew the truth. I paced back and forth, trying to come up with a plan. I needed to confront her, but how? What was I supposed to say? How do you confront the person you love, the person you've been planning a life with, about something like this? How do you even begin to process the betrayal of the woman you trusted with your future? And then it hit me. The wedding. The ceremony. The lie. I couldn't go through with it. I couldn't stand there, pretending everything was fine when I knew what she had done. The thought of walking down that aisle, watching her in her white dress, knowing she had shared intimate moments with someone else, made my stomach turn. There was no way I could do it. But what if I could expose her? What if I could show everyone the truth before it was too late? I took a deep breath, the idea forming in my mind, solidifying into something real. I knew what I had to do. I had to take control, to expose everything, to make sure she couldn't pretend anymore. The thought of her thinking she could get away with it, the thought of her lying to everyone, filled me with rage. She needed to face the consequences. The wedding day arrived, and the venue was alive with the hum of excitement. The air was thick with anticipation, the guests already beginning to gather, the sound of chatter and laughter filling the space. The lights were dimmed, the soft strains of music playing in the background. The room looked perfect, too perfect. It was as though the world outside had forgotten that everything had already fallen apart. I stood off to the side, watching as Eleanor and her bridesmaids walked around, laughing and chatting. She looked beautiful, radiant even, and for a moment, it almost made my heart ache. But then, the images flashed back in my mind. The kiss, the intimacy, the betrayal. And the ache turned to something darker, something colder. I felt sick. The guests began to take their seats, the anticipation rising. I knew it was time. I knew what I had to do. As the ceremony was about to begin, I stood up, my voice cutting through the air. "Excuse me, everyone," I said, my words clear and steady, though my heart was pounding in my chest. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to me. I felt the weight of every gaze on me, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't. "Before we begin the ceremony," I said, taking a deep breath, "I need to share something with all of you." Whispers spread through the room, confusion and curiosity blooming in the air. I didn't care. I know you've all been looking forward to this moment, but I have something to show you. Something important. Something you all need to see. A few of the guests exchanged confused looks, and Eleanor's eyes flickered nervously toward me. But I didn't care. She didn't get to control this anymore. She didn't get to hide behind a veil of lies. I paused for a moment, my eyes scanning the room, my heart still pounding in my chest. I could feel the tension building, the room on the edge of anticipation. "Let's take a look at some of the best moments Eleanor and I have shared together," I said, my voice steady, though my insides were shaking. "Our trips, our laughter, our love." The projector behind me flickered to life, and the first few photos appeared on the screen. Eleanor and I were smiling, hugging, laughing together on various trips. Pictures of a perfect couple, or so it seemed. A few of the guests smiled, clearly thinking I was about to share something sweet and sentimental. For a moment, I almost felt a pang of guilt. Almost. But then the photos changed. The room fell into stunned silence as the next image appeared on the screen. There was Eleanor kissing another man. The kiss was full of passion, a complete betrayal of everything she had promised me. The room erupted in hushed whispers, people exchanging confused glances, unsure of what they were seeing. A few looked toward Eleanor, their faces filled with shock. Her face went pale, her hand flying to her mouth as she gasped. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw pure panic in her eyes. The screen shifted again. This time, the video began to play of Eleanor and the man in the hotel room, oblivious to my presence. The video showed them in bed, kissing, undressing. My stomach turned as the sounds of their intimacy filled the room, sounds I never thought I would hear on this day. Gasps filled the room. The atmosphere went from confusion to anger, voices rising in accusation, some standing up, others in shock. Eleanor stood there, frozen, her face drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I could barely hear her as I spoke again, my voice cutting through the chaos. "The wedding's off," I said, my words ringing clear. "Eleanor showed me exactly who she is, and I won't pretend anymore." Her eyes filled with tears, but there was no sympathy left in me. She had betrayed me. She had stolen everything from me, and now everyone knew. The room exploded. Some guests were angry, others in disbelief, but I stood there, unmoving. The truth had come out, and there was no going back. The silence that followed my declaration felt suffocating. It was as if time itself had frozen, and in that moment, everything hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the truth I had just exposed. The chaos that erupted around me seemed far away, distant and muffled, as though I was standing in the eye of a storm. All I could hear was my own heartbeat, pounding loudly in my chest, and the sickening weight of everything that had just transpired. Eleanor stood there, her face pale and trembling, her eyes wide with disbelief. For a brief moment, she didn't move. I couldn't look at her. I didn't want to see the guilt, the shame, the pathetic attempt at an apology that I knew was coming. She had already said everything with her actions. Words meant nothing now. Some of the guests were still frozen, their faces caught between shock and anger. A few exchanged hushed whispers, and others were outright yelling, pointing fingers, accusing Eleanor of betrayal. I felt nothing for her now. I was numb to her, to the life we had built together. That person was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable. I could feel the eyes of the room on me, but I didn't care. I had made my choice. I had shown them all who Eleanor truly was. I had taken back my power, my agency, and I wouldn't let her, or anyone else, make me doubt myself. The wedding was over. "James, please, let me explain." Eleanor's voice broke through the noise, her words sharp with panic. She stepped toward me, her hands outstretched as if she could somehow bridge the gap that had opened between us. I didn't move. "Explain what?" I said coldly, my voice steady but laced with fury. "There's nothing left to explain. You've already shown me who you are." She looked like she might collapse, her knees buckling as the realization of what was happening settled in. Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't care. I wouldn't let her manipulate me again. "Not this time. I never meant to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. "You have to believe me. I was confused. Save it." I cut her off, shaking my head. "You made your choice. You've already done more than enough damage." I could hear the voices around us, people trying to comfort her, others shooting me angry looks, questioning me. But I didn't want to listen. I couldn't listen. I had just seen the woman I had loved, the woman I was supposed to marry, destroy everything with a single, selfish act. There was nothing left for me to hear from her. "I'm done," I said, my words final. "And I don't need any more lies from you." The room seemed to come alive around us. Eleanor, desperate, reached for me again, but I took a step back, avoiding her touch as though it burned. "James, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Don't do this. Don't throw everything away. We can fix this." "Fix this?" I scoffed. "How do you fix something like this? You can't undo what you've done." My chest tightened, the anger, the pain, the betrayal all crashing over me again. I had spent so long trusting her, believing in our future, and now that future was shattered, crumbled to dust at my feet. Some of the guests were looking at me with pity, while others whispered furiously about Eleanor. It didn't matter. I didn't care what anyone thought. This was my life, my decision, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate me any longer. "I think it's time for everyone to leave," I said, my voice sharp. "The wedding's over. I've had enough." A few guests began to stand, some looking at Eleanor with disbelief, others clearly angry with her. I watched them begin to file out of the venue, murmurs of judgment filling the air. As the room emptied, I was left with a strange, hollow feeling like I had just ripped something out of my life, and now there was nothing left but emptiness. Eleanor remained standing there, her face crumpled with shame, her eyes red and swollen from tears. She had no one now, not even me. And for the first time, I didn't feel a shred of sympathy for her. "You think this is the end?" she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible. "You think you've won?" I turned to face her, locking eyes with the woman I had once loved, the woman who had destroyed me. "No," I said coldly. "I've already won. You're the one who's lost everything." I didn't wait for her to respond. Without another word, I turned and walked away, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the now empty room. Behind me, I could feel the weight of her gaze, the remnants of what we had, but I refused to let it affect me. She had made her choice. Now I was making mine. As I walked out of the venue, the cool evening air hit my face, sharp and refreshing. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe again. The weight that had been pressing down on me for weeks, for months, had been lifted. I was free. And as I stepped out into the night, leaving behind the shattered remnants of a life I thought I wanted, I realized something. The pain would fade. The betrayal would sting for a while, but I would heal. And eventually, I would be stronger. Because this wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. I walked away from everything that had once been. The future I thought I was building, the life I had planned, it was all gone. But in that moment, I knew something else. I had just stepped into the unknown, and for the first time, I was free to choose my own path. And that was enough. The days that followed felt like a strange blur. Part of me detached from reality, trying to make sense of everything, while the other part was numb, simply going through the motions. The day after the wedding fiasco, I found myself sitting in a small cafe, nursing a black coffee, my mind still spinning. I hadn't spoken to Eleanor since the wedding, and I didn't intend to. She had tried calling, texting, even showing up at my door a couple of times, but I ignored her. There was no point in listening to her apologies or explanations. What was left to say? The truth had been laid bare for everyone to see. It was Matt who finally reached out. He had been there for me during all the early chaos, the days leading up to the wedding, and everything in between. He was the one who had warned me about Eleanor in the first place, and, as much as I hated to admit it, he had been right. I'd learned that lesson the hard way. "Hey man, it's me." Matt's voice crackled through the phone as I answered. "I just wanted to check in. How are you doing?" I let out a long sigh, my hand gripping the edge of the coffee cup as I leaned back in my chair. "I don't know. I don't even know who I am anymore," I replied, my voice hoarse, tired. "You're James," Matt said firmly. "You're not defined by what Eleanor did. Yeah, it hurts like hell right now, but you're still you. You'll find your way through this." I wanted to believe him. I did, but the weight of everything still pressed down on me. The life I had built, the dreams I'd had, gone in an instant. It wasn't just about the wedding, it was the years of trust and love that had been shattered by one single act of betrayal. It was hard to even look at the world around me without seeing the cracks where Eleanor had once been. "I feel like I'm just floating right now, man," I said, voice thick. Like everything I thought I knew was just a lie. "You're allowed to feel that way," Matt replied. "It's going to take time, but you've got this. You'll heal." I nodded, though I knew he couldn't see me. He was right, of course. It would take time, but the truth was that I had no idea where to start. How do you rebuild after something like that? How do you trust again? The next few days were a blur of empty moments and deep reflection. I stayed away from the places that reminded me of Eleanor. I sold the engagement ring, the one I'd spent months saving for, the one I thought would symbolize the future we were supposed to have. I couldn't bear to see it, let alone wear it. Every time I thought of it, it only reminded me of the lies, the empty promises. I started spending more time with Matt. He'd been my best friend for years, and I realized I'd been neglecting him for too long, too wrapped up in my own world with Eleanor. But now, with the life I'd once known slipping away, Matt was my anchor. He dragged me out of my apartment, making me go for walks, watch stupid movies, and just remind me what it felt like to laugh. Slowly, the numbness started to ease. But then there were the quiet nights, the moments alone when my mind would wander back to Eleanor. I'd remember the way she used to smile, how her laugh would fill a room, the soft way she'd say my name. And then I'd remember the betrayal, the lies, the images I couldn't get out of my head. It was a vicious cycle. Every time I thought I was moving forward, I'd be pulled back into the past, and it hurt all over again. I wasn't sure what would come next for me, but one thing was clear. I needed to start living for myself again. It was 2 weeks after the wedding that I found myself sitting at a new desk in a coffee shop, tapping away on a laptop. I had always loved writing, but somewhere along the way, I'd stopped doing it. It felt like a lifetime ago, but now, in the silence of the small cafe, I found myself writing again. I had no idea if it was any good, but it didn't matter. The words were flowing, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of purpose. I needed to create something. Anything. I didn't want to sit around being consumed by the anger and hurt that had nearly swallowed me whole. That night, after I finished my writing, I grabbed my jacket and headed out. There was a new sense of freedom inside me, a sense of space that hadn't been there before. I walked through the streets of the city, the weight that had been there for so long now lighter. I didn't know where I was going or what would come next, but for the first time, I felt like I was moving forward. And that's when I saw her. It wasn't Eleanor. It wasn't anyone I knew, but she caught my eye. A woman, sitting at an outdoor table, sipping coffee. She smiled at me as I walked past, And something about that simple gesture stopped me in my tracks. It was nothing dramatic, just a smile. But it was the first time in weeks that I felt a flicker of something. Not hope, necessarily, but maybe just the beginning of something new. I didn't approach her. I didn't even stop to talk. But I smiled back. That moment, simple as it was, made me realize that I wasn't done. Life hadn't ended with the wedding. The world kept turning, people kept moving, and so would I. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be painless. But I would heal. I would find my way back to the person I used to be, or maybe even someone better. As I continued down the street, I felt something shift in me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not for Eleanor, not for anything that had been, but for the future. It was still out there. And maybe, just maybe, I could find it again. The journey ahead wasn't clear. But one thing was certain. I was no longer going to let the past define me. I was moving forward, one step at a time. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of what that future might hold.